telling people in Bangladesh, oh, go ahead, get rid of it. In fact, you've got to send your kids off to school for 18 years. This would solve nothing, and it would lead to immense misery. All right, I won't go into the 19th century, but the 19th century, of course, we all know, that's when we had our way, right? Everything was laissez-faire in the 19th century, everything was terrible. You know what, doggone it, I will go to the 19th century. I'll say one thing about that. Don't listen to what I say the first time, listen to the second one. Tom DiLorenzo actually bothered to look up the numbers. Can you believe we've been lectured to in our rotten textbooks year after year about the monopolists who dominated in the 19th century, and all these industries were monopolized. Oh yeah? How about looking? Could I trouble you to look up the numbers? So it turns out there are 17 industries for which data are available that were accused of being monopolized by a handful of firms. And in the neoclassical definition of monopoly, a monopoly is when prices go up and quantity produced goes down. And yet when we look at these 17 industries, with the one exception of castor oil, I think the country could get by with that. With the one exception of castor oil, the allegedly monopolized industries were lowering prices faster than any other industries in the economy. And they were increasing their output faster than any other industries in the economy. But there's a lot more that can be said about that, but I have forsworn to discuss it. Oh, but what about Scandinavia? Don't you know Denmark is such a great place? Don't you people know that Sweden exists? Haven't you heard Bernie Sanders talk about Sweden? All right. I'm going to say a couple quick things about Sweden and Denmark. And also Norway, by the way. Norway, if you'd like your taxes to be 70%, well, yeah, you will get some free stuff. It would be a miracle if you didn't. Well, how about Denmark? All right, well, it turns out if you look at Denmark and where it ranks on the Economic Freedom of the World Index, it's higher than the U.S. when it comes to property rights protection, legal system, openness to international trade, sound money. Well, that's not what the New York Times told me. You don't say. And it turns out, yeah, that's right, we could be against the New York Times. I'm against the New York Times. The New York Times might even go out of existence in our lifetimes. What a glorious development that is. All right. In Denmark, 3 of their 98 municipalities, only 3, will have a majority of people working. 3. And that's a combination of the aging of the labor force, which is also encouraged by the welfare state not reproducing enough, and secondly, by all the benefits, all the welfare state benefits. It's 9% of the potential labor force has lifetime disability. That is huge. That's impossible. So they've started slashing the benefits, unemployment benefits. They've slashed the term you can receive them in half. They're going the other direction from where Bernie wants them. So it turns out the Sweden and Denmark story is quite different. In fact, Sweden became wealthy because it was free market. That's how it became wealthy. It's the old saying of how do you acquire a small fortune? Answer: you start with a big fortune, you blow a lot of it, you wind up with a small fortune. That's the secret to where Sweden is. It started out because it avoided war and it had a basically free market. And even into the 1950s, it had lower government spending in terms of GDP than the U.S. did. And then you got the welfare state, and yeah, okay, it had built up the money that it could have to spend on that stuff. But by the mid-1990s, the number of net private sector jobs created in Sweden was 0. Yeah, and you know, I didn't read that in the New York Times either. So the libertarian case is pretty darn good. Pretty good. We're not crazy after all. Well, you know, there is a guy walking around with a boot on his head, so I'm not going to say we're none of us are crazy. I say that affectionately, you all understand. What they'll throw at you right now, though, is what about that financial crisis? Wasn't that capitalism run amok? Don't you libertarians have a lot to answer for because of that? Okay. Yeah, because we had supposedly deregulation. All right. Well, first of all, I have to say, because I had a great guest on my show, TomWoods.com. I did a show on deregulation and the financial crisis. We went through the so-called repeal of Glass-Steagall and the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. These are completely irrelevant to the financial financial crisis, which would have occurred exactly the way it did, and to the exact extent that it did, regardless of what had been done in those cases. Secondly, oh yeah, we've cut back on regulation, sure. Spending on financial regulation since 1980, in real terms, adjusting for inflation, has tripled. And it increased under that laissez-faire George W. Bush, by the way. I say laissez-faire somewhat ironically. On the eve of the financial crisis, on the state and federal level, the number of agencies given the task of regulating the financial sector was 115. Not enough regulation going on. If only we'd had 116 agencies, that would have done the trick. What is wrong with these people? You look at all these bad mortgages, 75% of them are on the books of Fannie and Freddie. They're on the books of basically a so-called public-private partnership that got government guarantees that everybody knew about, that was obvious, and the Federal Reserve. And we're not supposed to talk about the Federal Reserve. The Bernie people will talk about everything in the world, but almost never will Janet Yellen get blamed for anything, or Ben Bernanke, or Alan Greenspan. These people coast by. That's just the way they like it, totally undetected. All right, you guys all know the lessons of I pencil, right? But this is also part of our message, that even without coercion, we don't need a pencil czar ordering people around saying, you go chop down the wood and you manufacture the paint and you refine the oil for the gasoline to transport the paint and you make the rubber for the tires for the vehicle transporting the paint and whatever. I mean, when you think about it, as you all know from Leonard Read and Milton Friedman, making a pencil is actually extremely complicated. There are many, many production processes to produce them that have to come together at just the right time and in just the right quantities and with no surpluses or shortages. And yet that happens all the time, every day. In fact, you see a pencil on the ground, I mean, you pretty much ignore it, spit on it, right? You should be looking at it saying, wow, what a miracle of peaceful commerce together. Because that is what it is. It's extraordinary. And we're not taught to appreciate that, because in school, are we taught to appreciate how markets coordinate production without a guy with a bullhorn? Of course not. We're taught how a bill becomes a law. Oh, so we all know how the government can get things done. We have no idea how we get things done. You know, they say libertarians think we should do nothing. Depends on what you mean by we. They should do nothing. We can get a lot done. Prices are what make possible all this miraculous coordination. And prices emerge not by government dictates, but by the ordinary course of buying and selling. That gives rise to prices, which allows entrepreneurs to make calculations about resource allocation, what to produce and how to produce it, with what combination of factors of production. There is an infinite number of possibilities here to choose from. How would you choose if you didn't have freely created prices? This is a miracle. I mean, if you think it's boring that the abundance you see around you is created with no central direction, if you think that's boring, then yeah, maybe the Libertarian Party doesn't have much for you. But if you find this extraordinary, and even more extraordinary that nobody thought it was important enough to bother teaching you about it, then you're definitely in the right place. Now notice what I've just done here. I've talked to you about the basic principles of libertarianism, and I've talked to you about a whole bunch of things that followed from non-aggression. A tremendous achievement in bringing down poverty rates, in eliminating, not encouraging, but eliminating child labor. Progress that's been greater than we've seen in the so-called social democracies, in scientific achievement. And I've noted also that with sound money, now I have a whole book on this, but with sound money and without a Federal Reserve, we would not have had the financial crisis of 2008. We would have had financial stability. And yes, I know there were financial crises in the 19th century, but I've dealt with that in Rollback and Meltdown, my two books on this general subject. But now notice in doing this, I did not have to borrow a little bit from the left and a little bit from the right. I didn't have to borrow from conservatism or borrow from liberalism.